speak to us through it now. Well, what strange times we live in. A gathering crisis over the cost of living, the rising price of energy, food, petrol, and the desperate need for government intervention. Threats to our security abroad and at home, the prospect of a winter of discontent with strikes all over the place and the possibility of energy rationing in the winter. For those old enough to remember the 70s, it all has a strange sense of déjà vu. And all the time, we've had no real government in place for the last however many weeks. And now at last we're about to discover who will be our next Prime Minister. We're told it's a foregone conclusion. And how they will respond to the challenges of our times. Whoever it is, and whatever their policies, we should be surely looking to God for the future of our nation. At the moment, it seems he's left out of the picture, and we're set for sad decline, unless God in his grace and mercy intervenes. Well, as we turn to the book of 1 Samuel, we see a very similar picture. At the start of this book, Israel is still in the age of the judges, a time of crisis and moral compromise. As we're told in the last verse of the book of Judges, in those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as they saw fit. That's the situation at the start of 1 Samuel. And the whole book deals with the question of who rules the people and the search for a leader who will reflect God's character. From Eli and his apostate sons to Samuel, a true prophet, from Saul, the king who rebels against the Lord, to David, the man after God's heart, who will be Israel's greatest king. And yet, ultimately, even he is seriously flawed. In reality, it is only in Jesus Christ that the true king will be found. Of course, 1 Samuel isn't only about politics. It's about people, men and women, old men and children, and the story of how they relate or fail to relate to the living God. Here we see some of the most beloved stories in the Bible. Hannah's prayer, the calling of Samuel in the sanctuary, and David's triumph over Goliath. And through it all we see, as in today's passage, a God who turns the world's values upside down, the God who looks on the heart, the living rock who gives power to the weak and brings to nothing those who trust in their own strength. And it's the same God who speaks to us through his word today. So I want to dive straight in with today's very moving and powerful passage. And I want to look at Hannah's plight, secondly at Hannah's plea, and then lastly at Hannah's great prayer of praise. So firstly, Hannah's plight. The story begins with a man called Elkanah, and verse 2 gives us the crux of the story in a nutshell. He had two wives. One was called Hannah and the other Peninnah. Peninnah had children, but Hannah had none. Let's just stop there before we go on. Firstly, we've got the question of polygamy, of having more than one wife. The Old Testament never explicitly condemns polygamy, In Elkanah's time, it was culturally acceptable for a man to take a second wife if his first wife was unable to bear children, and indeed for kings to have many wives like David and Solomon. But wherever it happens, we see that it leads to problems. As Jesus later affirms, the book of Genesis makes clear that God's purpose for marriage is one woman and one man. Genesis 1 verse 27, male and female he created them. And Genesis 2 verses 24, that is why a man leaves his father and mother and is united to his wife, and they become one flesh. Maybe unpopular in our age, but that's the foundational teaching of the Bible. And here in this story we see the obvious tensions that polygamy creates between these two wives, the jealousy, the rivalry, and the taunts. So that's one issue. And the other is the question of Hannah's childlessness. And of course, I'm all too aware that this may be a very painful topic to some. It was a source of great sadness to Hannah in her day, and there may be many who find it distressing today. But I'm afraid we can't avoid it. We don't know why some must suffer in this way. But interestingly, Hannah is not the only woman in the Bible who suffers like this. There is Sarah, Rachel, Manoah's wife, who eventually gave birth to Samson, and Elizabeth, the eventual mother of John the Baptist. It seems that God has a pattern of bringing blessing for his people out of such sadness and pain. We can't understand what he's doing, but he has a plan and a purpose to bring blessing in ways that we cannot grasp. Of course, Hannah's pain was made worse by other people. Her rival, Peninnah, loved to rub salt in her wounds and provoke her so that she wept and was unable to eat. And what did Elkanah think about all this? Despite his polygamy, it seems that Elkanah was a faithful believer. In spite of the general state of the times, he and his family went up to Shiloh each year to worship the Lord. Yet if he was faithful, it seems he was also maybe a bit slow on the uptake. I thought of all kinds of synonyms for that. It was a bit dim, it was a bit whatever, but anyway. Although he loved Hannah and wanted to help her, he seemed incapable of understanding things from her perspective. Hannah, why are you weeping? Why don't you eat? Why are you downhearted? Don't I mean more to you than 10 sons? I have to say, it sounds like a typical man. Surely he should have said, don't you mean more to me than 10 sons? Don't I mean more to you? Honestly. But there you go, it was a patriarchal age. Elkanah was unable to understand or help Hannah's sad situation. But thankfully, as we shall see, our God doesn't share such limitations. He knows our deepest pains and he cares for us in them. So that's Hannah's plight. Secondly, we see Hannah's plea. All this time, Peninnah kept rubbing it in, but in God's sovereign grace, her taunts drove Hannah to seek God's face. In her deep anguish, Hannah prayed to the Lord, weeping bitterly. She instinctively knew that God would understand her sadness and that he was ready to listen to her. in the same way, when we're grappling with deep distress, we too can cry out to God and know that he understands our pain. The God of the Bible understands and cares about our deepest distress. Sometimes we feel that he's deaf to our cries, but the reality is that he stands with us in our pain. If you ever doubt it, take a long, hard look at the cross. We can cry out to the Lord, expressing our deepest feelings. Our God can take it, and he's ready to listen. And she made a vow, saying, Lord Almighty, if you will only look on your servant's misery and remember me, and not forget your servant, but give her a son, then I will give him to the Lord for all the days of his life. And no razor will be used on his head. I think it's difficult to evaluate Hannah's prayer here. Hopefully, we all know that God cannot be manipulated or bargained with. We've probably all tried it, but it doesn't work. But her cry was simple and sincere before the Lord, coming from a heart of genuine faith and trust. Here we see a genuine believer crying out in faith and dependence upon her God. And yet, once again, we see a man failing to understand. Verse 12, as she kept on praying to the Lord, Eli observed her mouth. Hannah was praying in her heart, and her lips were moving, but her voice was not heard. Eli thought she was drunk and said to her, how long are you going to stay drunk? Put away your wine. You know, one who should be Israel's spiritual leader fails to recognize her fervent prayer. And he forces Hannah to defend herself. Not so, my lord, Hannah replies. I'm a woman who is deeply troubled. I've not been drinking wine or beer. I was pouring out my soul to the Lord. And to give Eli credit, he now responds pastorally. Eli answered, go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant you what you have asked of him. And Hannah leaves, filled with assurance that her prayer has been heard. Then she went her way and ate something, and her face was no longer downcast. Having left her problem with God, Hannah comes away with a new peace. And in the course of time, Hannah became pregnant and gave birth to a son. Of course, we know that that won't happen to everyone in this situation who prays to the Lord. It's right to seek the Lord, to cry out to him for the miracle we desire. But there may come a time when we need to accept his will, to leave it with him, and to move forward, trusting him to bless us in other ways. And I don't say that glibly or easily. Certainly Hannah didn't take the gift of a child for granted. She recognised that he was a precious gift of God. So we see her naming him Samuel, because I asked the Lord for him. And as the footnote in our Bible says, the name Samuel sounds like the Hebrew for heard by God. And she doesn't forget her vow, but takes her promise seriously. So when the boy is a suitable age, she takes him and presents him at the sanctuary, saying to Eli, I am the woman who stood beside you praying to the Lord. I prayed for this child, and the Lord has granted me what I asked of him. So now I give him to the Lord. For his whole life he shall be given over to the Lord. What an act of sacrifice by this faithful woman. But also what an act of joy to be able to dedicate her child to the Lord, who had given her so much. In a lesser way, isn't this part of what we do when we bring our children for dedication? Giving them back to the Lord, and asking him to bless them in his service. And in all our worship, aren't we looking but to give back to the Lord who's given us so much? F.F. Bruce said, with Christianity, salvation is grace, and Christian life and Christian living is gratitude. Salvation is grace, and Christian living is gratitude. Well, I get the impression that Hannah is filled with joy to be able to present her son to the Lord in this way. She'll have 5 more children, but she will never forget this special son who is serving the Lord in the sanctuary. And what about Samuel? I guess that he'll have been prepared for this moment since birth. He may have looked forward to Shiloh as some do starting at school. I remember Bethany's first day at school. There were all these little children clinging tearfully to their mother's legs. And Bethany skipped off happily without a backward glance. In gratitude, the Lord's gift is given over to the Lord's service. And he in turn takes this willing sacrifice and makes him a prophet who will be used mightily in the life of his nation and in God's purposes of salvation. So I wonder, what will God do with our willing sacrifices to bring glory to his name? What will God do with the sacrifices of our heart? Those things that we willingly and joyfully give over to him. He can take them and use them for his glory in amazing ways. So we've seen Hannah's plight and Hannah's plea. And then lastly, we look at Hannah's praise in chapter 2. It's a famous song picked up again in Mary's Magnificat in Luke's Gospel. But here we see Hannah rejoicing and delighting in the God of reversals. Then Hannah prayed and said, "My heart rejoices in the Lord. In the Lord my horn is lifted high." The word horn here is a symbol for strength. In God, Hannah has been greatly strengthened, so she delights in his deliverance, and she boasts in the Lord. Did you know it's all right to boast? We're not supposed to boast in ourselves or earthly things, but we are supposed to boast in the Lord. Hannah boasts in the Lord. There is no one holy like the Lord. There is no one beside you. There is no rock like our God. Hannah's joy is in God himself, and so should ours be. Our God is the one true rock, a rock on which to stand, a rock that provides refuge for his people, unlike the so-called gods of the nations. We can build our lives on him and take refuge in him alone. And now Hannah is emboldened to rebuke the worldly. Do not keep talking so proudly, or let your mouth speak such arrogance. For the Lord is a God who knows, and by him deeds are weighed. What's going on here? Well, Hannah could be taking a sideways look at Peninnah. Remember how Peninnah has been constantly putting Hannah down, and now Hannah's been lifted up and blessed by God. So it wouldn't be surprising if Hannah was speaking to Peninnah and saying, "Take that, Peninnah. God has heard my prayer. Where is your taunting now?" But I think she's speaking more generally to all those who speak proudly and do not revere God, to unbelievers in general. Do not keep talking so proudly, or let your mouth speak such arrogance. For the Lord is a God who knows, and by him deeds are weighed. Surely that's a word for people like Richard Dawkins or anybody else who speaks so proudly and contempt and dismissal of our God. We see the sheer foolishness of all human arrogance, because the Lord is a God who sees and he weighs men's actions and the attitudes of their hearts. And our God is a God of reversals, a God who turns earthly values upside down. So in verse 4, the bows of the warriors are broken, but those who stumbled are armed with strength. Isn't that typical of our God? The strong made weak and the weak made strong. We see it so clearly actually in this book with the giant Goliath cut down to size by the sling of young David. Our God is a God of reversals. Verse 5, those who are full hire themselves out for food, but those who are hungry no more. She who was barren has borne 7 children, but she who has had many sons pines away. Again, Hannah could be speaking about herself and Peninnah, but I believe she's generalising here. She may be starting from her own experience, but then she's widening it out, rejoicing in God's general pattern of working. Look at verse 7. The Lord sends poverty and wealth. He humbles and he exalts. Isn't that the pattern that we see throughout the Bible? As Jesus says in Luke 18 verse 14, for all those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. It's only as we are humbled in repentance that we can receive the blessings of salvation. Verse 8, he raises the poor from the dust and lifts the needy from the ash heap. He seats them with princes and has them inherit a throne of honour. We have a God who cares for the poor, who is able to bring great reversals. And again in the gospel we see him lifting us up from the scrap heap and lifting us up to the highest place, seated with Christ in the highest place and given a wonderful inheritance. For the foundations of the earth are the Lord's. On them he has set the world. Our God is sovereign over all creation. That's the folly of the self-made man, that he leaves no room for God his creator. Verse 9, he will guard the feet of his faithful servants, but the wicked will be silenced in the place of darkness. When we're slandered or discriminated against for our Christian faith, we can trust the Lord. I heard the story of George Whitefield recently, the great 18th century evangelist who preached the gospel to thousands in the Great Awakening. And because of his success, Whitefield was often slandered and reviled, and his friends desperately wanted him to defend himself. But Whitefield said, I am content to wait till the judgment day for the clearing up of my reputation. And after I am dead, I desire no other epitaph than this. Here lies G.W. What sort of man he was, the great day will discover. Isn't that a great epitaph? He's not worried about defending his own reputation. Here lies G.W. What sort of man he was, the great day will discover. Because that's true for all of us. When slandered or discriminated against as Christians, let's trust in God. But for those who persist in opposing God, there's only a fearful prospect of judgments to come. As Hannah continues, it's not by strength that one prevails. Those who oppose the Lord will be broken. That's the folly of continuing in rebellion against God, who is the judge of all the earth. He is the one who will bring the mighty ones of this world to judgment. And Hannah ends up with these wonderful words in verse 10. He will give strength to his king and exalt the horn of his anointed. Just as God has acted in her life, she trusts God to act in the life of her nation and to strengthen the king. And that's remarkable. At this point, there was no king, but Moses had spoken of the kings to come, each of whom would be anointed. But of course, the ultimate anointed one is Jesus Christ, the Messiah. He is the one in whom deliverance is found, in whom the weak are made strong, the poor made rich, the hungry fed, the humble exalted, and the destitute given an inheritance. And just look at verse 6. The Lord brings death and makes alive. He brings down to the grave and raises up. Jesus is the one who went down to the grave and then was raised up in his mighty resurrection, so that we also may be raised to life. That's surely the greatest reversal of all. So may we be thankful to God for this humble woman and her simple faith. And may we put our trust in the God who is a living rock, who can be depended upon. The God of reversals, who's able to bring joy from sadness, triumph from adversity, and life even out of death. May his name be praised. Amen.